Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, good night, Project Kazimierz listener and Facebook Live viewers. We've got a very interesting guest on the show today, David Troy, who I've met through the TEDx network, who's one of the rare people I've met in my life who's had the privilege and honor of giving a TED talk. Rather, Dave, than me introducing you in a ham-fisted way, why don't you go ahead and do the honors in the way you would if you bumped into a total stranger and wanted to keep it under a minute or two?
Yeah, so my name is Dave Troy, and I am an entrepreneur based in Baltimore, Maryland, USA. I am very interested in data visualization, also politics, and kind of accountability in politics, and how do we use data to kind of improve our understanding of civil society and of policy and things like that. So yeah, I've been an entrepreneur since I was a teenager. Started with a computer sales business in the 80s, and then morphed into selling internet services and web hosting in the 90s. Sold that business in the early 2000s, and then spent a few years kind of traveling the world, doing some different things in voice over IP and the like, and then got involved with Twitter in the very early months of Twitter, and did a data visualization project called Twitter Vision, which was basically doing a geographic visualization of all of the traffic on Twitter at that time, which wasn't very much, but that project got a lot of attention and ended up in the Museum of Modern Art. That kind of fueled my desire to kind of get back into doing new entrepreneurial projects, and so I started a company called 410 Labs with a co-founder in 2010. And we are focused on making tools for email at the moment. So we have a web-based product called Maelstrom, and then a iOS product called Chuck, both of which help you process your email a lot more efficiently, and are getting a decent amount of traction. And so alongside that, I've also been continuing my interest in social media data visualization. I did a TED Talk, as Richard said, in 2014 at TED Global, which got a lot of attention and has, I think, 1.3 some million views. And so I've traveled around the world talking about those topics, and that in turn has got me plugged into what's been happening with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, and that whole saga. So I was in on that pretty early and started, digging into that and researching it. So I've been working with journalists and various kinds of researchers from a lot of different outlets on trying to understand that whole situation. And yeah, so that pretty much brings us up to 2019. And during that whole time, I guess from 2009 to 2019, I've been, the curator and producer of TEDx Mid-Atlantic in Washington, D.C., along with a co-curator and a team of amazing volunteers. So that's, certainly between all of these things, I have been very busy. So
yes, yeah, I certainly got the impression you're a busy person. And for those wanting links, I'm going to be posting both in the show notes if you're listening to the audio edition or on the Project Kazimierz webpage. But for now, on the Facebook live stream, I'll be posting links into the various things that David's talking about in his business and so on. And so I read recently on your Facebook page you made some fairly trenchant comments about the leadership skills of the founder of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, and who was on the stage of TEDx. And for those, we had a TEDx Kazimierz Live just last Saturday where we showed Carol Codweller's I wouldn't exactly say pioneering talk, but important talk about Facebook and the responsibility of the leaders of the what she called I think the gods of tech, the leaders of Silicon Valley. And you spotted this early, and because this is such an important and hot topic, your TED talk was about social connections in particular cities, and your TEDx Oxford talk I think was one of the first public places where someone drew attention to Cambridge Analytica. But could you take us back to the beginning of that idea and that awareness? When was it that you spotted something that you felt other people hadn't spotted, or if they had spotted, they hadn't started talking about in the space of social media, political mapping, interest mapping, and so on?
Sure. So I started getting involved with visualizing, this traffic on Twitter geographically in like 2007. And geographic is interesting because you get to see, sort of what cities things are happening in and whatnot. But I realized that I was really more interested in something deeper than that. And I didn't quite know what it was I was after or how I was trying to articulate it. But what I was really interested in, it turns out, was the social connections that form between people. So if you have 100,000 people and you say, okay, make friends and document who your friends are, that turns out to kind of have kind of repeatable particular processes, so that you end up with a set of links between people that are, you would think, like, in an ideal world, if you had a room full of 10 people, that all of them would be friends with each other, and so you'd end up with 10 friends, and then there's a formula, n times n minus 1 over 2, so there would be 90, so you'd have 45 friendships between 10 people, because you can't be friends with yourself. You can be friends with everybody else, though. So if you take that at scale, like 100,000 people, if you try to have, everybody be friends with everybody but themselves, that would be the sort of ideal social arrangement, but that's never what happens. People group into smaller subgroups for whatever reason. So you end up with the people that like sports over here, and the people that like art over here, and the people that like politics over here. And so I realized that was the phenomenon that I was interested in at scale. And so I started looking at that on Twitter for cities, and basically saying, how does a city organize itself into areas of interest? And is that similar in different cities, or how is it the same? How is it different? And I realized in looking at that there was a tremendous amount of power to affect good, to like make the world a better place, and to say, oh, you know what, you artists that don't like sports, you should maybe talk to these particular sports people, because maybe there's something that you could figure out to do together that would be cool. And you realize there's this opportunity for building connections. And what a lot of people, what the Cambridge Analytica type folks did, was looked at that and said, oh, here's a tremendous way to manipulate people and to divide people and to create tension around certain topics and whatever. And so Cambridge Analytica, in combination with Russia's Internet Research Agency and various other people, have figured out ways to weaponize that data, when I was kind of looking at it as a way to do good. And I think I was naive to think that this sort of thing would be only a force for good. Obviously, it could be a force for evil. It just didn't necessarily occur to me that anybody would really take that approach that seriously and that quickly. So yeah, I ended up meeting Jack Dorsey back in like 2007 as a result of this work, and got to talk with him some about ideas for rolling out. At the time, there was no location attribute in Twitter. So we talked about ways to add that in, and ultimately it did get added into Twitter. And then in late 2016, early 2017, I managed to connect with Carol Cadwallader around some of the research that I had done around this kind of mapping. And so in working with Carol, I traded a bunch of notes with her, and I actually invited Carol to speak at our TEDx, and the timing wasn't quite right, but we were sort of keeping it open, and then she ended up speaking at TED. So it's kind of like, I don't like to sort of say that I have special powers in this regard. I think anybody can do this, but if you are sort of tuned in enough to kind of what's happening in the world and can get to some of it a little bit early, then you end up sort of being 2 years ahead of the curve or more on all kinds of stuff. And that's just kind of where I found myself, is like, okay, I'm having conversations that are going to end up being big news in a couple of years, because I just got in on some of this stuff earlier. So anyway, that's kind of that whole story.
Okay. And obviously you're an entrepreneur, and entrepreneurs tend to have that interesting characteristic of, while being interested in ideas, feeling the need to put them into practice. And when you first started having these insights, you mentioned the sort of, what I suppose what you might call the social opportunity, the idea that you can make cities better places rather than manipulate people. Did you explore ways of doing that? Were you involved in any projects to try to sort of integrate communities or bring people together, or was it more an analytical piece for you?
So I would say that's still a work in progress. One of the first things I did was to connect with someone at Facebook who was in charge of social good and that sort of thing. And so I went out to Palo Alto and met with some folks at Facebook around ways to use that data, the data that they have, in ways that could be done ethically, to try to improve cities. And, you know, the bottom line was that they were sort of interested in it, but at the same time, like, it didn't drive their key metrics, which really is, you know, ad revenue and time on site. I think in their mind, this was kind of a interesting side, you know, topic. So turns out that the guy who was interested in social good there ended up leaving. I think they have new people in that role, and I'm, you know, currently attempting to connect with them. But I mean, you know, I think one of the challenges at Facebook is that their leadership has been so ham-handed around, you know, managing privacy and managing, you know, really the rights of users, and also, you know, dealing with this extremely complicated regulatory situation that is going to be more than likely imposed upon them, and rightfully so. I mean, their Q1 2019 legal bill on their, you know, public stock filing was $3 billion. So, you know, when your legal bill for the quarter is $3 billion, you know you have a lot of complicated stuff going on. And I don't know whether they're going to be able to bring themselves around as a company to like think this way. But if they can, then I'm, you know, happy to try to work with them. And so I'm continuing in that regard. The other thing that I'm starting to look into seriously is doing an art exhibit around this kind of data visualization, but also you know, photographs and other things that are derived from the inquiry of that data. And so I'm starting to kind of plot that now, but that's an idea that I had back 5 years ago. But you know, it takes some time to kind of build up a strategy for how to execute it and find funding and all that. So I'm hopeful. Actually, I had a meeting yesterday about that, and I'm hopeful that maybe we can get something on the books for like 2020 or 2021 that might explore that. But yeah, I think it's a perfectly viable strategy. It just takes time.
Yeah. Okay. And obviously, so if the big social media companies wanted to engage with you positively, do you have like a hit list of 3 things that you'd like them to start doing now to make the potential in the networks more socially productive, or is it more like brainstorming and just going through functionality on the site and what you can switch on and off? Is it a scalable thing, or like individual projects that you could get people working on?
So I'm more interested in kind of like what goes on the back end of the network than like the features of the product right at the moment. I think that the features of the product, you know, need a lot of work and need a lot of consideration around what the intentionality is of the design of the product. Mm-hmm. But what I'd be interested in is doing something like looking at anonymized graphs of, say, like city scale data, and figuring out what insights you can learn from that in an anonymized way. And then to the extent that you had a desire or a need to try to de-anonymize certain aspects of it, to see if there's a way to do that ethically in order to achieve a specific strategy of connecting people. One of the biggest problems in a city, say like Baltimore, where I live, is that there are a lot of people who are, you know, in little tribal cliques that don't know each other. And being able to, you know, kind of say, okay, you know, there's this many groups of people, this is the characteristics, and then being able to plot a strategy for how do you connect people and get people to trust each other more. That kind of thing is a very long-term kind of project, and having that kind of data could be helpful. But I also think just looking at that kind of data at scale, you would be able to identify other potential experiments and ideas that could fall out of that. They, to Facebook's credit, just a couple of days ago, they're saying that they're planning to expand the access for academics to get, you know, access to some aspects of Facebook's data. I am not an academic. I'm an entrepreneur. So, you know, I've got to either find an academic person to partner with or convince them that I meet their standard. And then also, I don't know, you know, until I get my hands in there, I don't know what exactly they're proposing people have access to and whether or not it's, you know, particularly useful or not. So, you know, again, I think you have to approach all this kind of with some cautious optimism that there's going to be some kind of an opportunity to do something good here over time, but it isn't going to happen overnight. Mostly because the companies have, you know, I think they were a little bit sloppy in letting as much information as they did slip out, but it kind of showed what was possible. And since 2015, you know, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you know, basically all the major social networks have clamped down on what data you can get access to. And I think that's appropriate in many ways, but I also think it's stifled, you know, a little bit of what might be possible. So
that was exactly the point I was going to make, that, you know, like any new powerful tool, it can be used for positive purposes or negative purposes. And, you know, just literally this coming week, there's an online website to do with news about Poland in English, run by quite established academics, called Notes from Poland, and they're having a pilot meetup. And I've offered, because I've got a lot of community building experience in my entrepreneurship community leader role, and as a TEDx organizer, I'm offering to help with that. And you know, it would be very nice to figure out how to target their readers more accurately. And once upon a time, that would have been quite easy, but post Cambridge Analytica, for good reasons, that it's much harder than it used to be. So it's sort of, there's I suppose you're trying to find a way to stop the baby being thrown out with the bathwater of political advertising and stuff like that.
Sure, and I think just find whatever the compromise is to try to do something good while protecting people, you know, from dishonest actors. Okay,
well, and if there's anything you want to share with our community, you know, there's I'm not quite sure what that would be, but certainly, you know, the TEDx Kazimierz and the TEDx community here in Poland is interested in your work, and you know, I think probably we can't be much more than a little extra distribution channel. But if you've got questions or things, we're sort of on hand to give you a perspective from the other side of the world, if you like.
Well, one thing I've been thinking about is, you know, after having done you know, 10 years or so of that kind of TEDx curatorial work, I'm pretty good at it. You know, I've got a pretty good idea of kind of what topics are interesting to audiences, and you know, I've been thinking about ways to kind of leverage that in ways to connect folks from like different parts of the world. So like, you know, if you had people from this market, say like the Washington DC or US East Coast arena that, you know, you were interested in connecting with, you know, in your community, I would be potentially interested in helping you to make those connections and to, you know, shape what that pitch could look like. We could even do some kind of cooperative thing between, you know, our event and your event, and just, you know, try to somehow or another leverage the skill that I've developed, you know, and people like you and a lot of others have as well. But how do we make that be something that we can share not only with our own local communities, but to get it more plugged into what's happening around the world?
Yeah, well, certainly, we love doing that sort of thing, and you know, whether it's at the TEDx level, because I one of the beauties for me of being a TEDx curator is what I call the superpower of giving you the right to pick up the phone, contact anyone anywhere, and say, I see this thing you're working on. That might be very interesting. And then this podcast also, it gives me a kind of access to a different group of people who have ideas to share, and in the startup community as well. And you know, clearly there's an overlap. So I think you can say, or we can just agree on that, green light for brainstorming ideas to and fro. And if any of our listeners are interested in doing something that would make more sense to launch, you know, both on David's side of the Atlantic and mine, I can't speak for Dave on this, but he's just said he's open. So and I'm a great fan of pilot projects and tests. You know, the worst that can happen if you do a pilot is no one shows up, and that tells you something.
And between the two of us, we have a ridiculous network that we could also share with. So, you know, I mean, that's kind of what I'm thinking is like, how do we leverage this network better? I mean, we already do to a large extent, but how could we do even more?
Yeah, and sometimes, like, if you've got a very powerful thing, an extra 10 or 20% leverage out of that powerful thing goes a lot better than a breakthrough in something that's never happened before, because you scale much better. Good. Yep. Well, so that's certainly very, very positive. Now, I wanted to come on to your, there's two other important parts of your life that we know a bit about, but not that much about. One is the entrepreneurship and piece, and the other is the TEDx history. But if we go to entrepreneurship first, you said you've been interested and active in entrepreneurship from quite a young age, which isn't true of all the entrepreneurs we have on the show. And I'm really interested to know, when was the first entrepreneurial moment in your life that you can remember, and where did that inspiration come from? Was it, I won't make any suggestions, I'm just going to listen.
Yeah, sure. So, you know, I think if you ask my parents, they'll tell you that the first thing that I did was when we moved to our current or to our home in Maryland, where I had been born in California, but we moved to Maryland when I was very young. I started making paper airplanes and putting them into a trash bag and carrying them around the neighborhood and selling small ones for a nickel, medium ones for a dime, and large ones for a quarter. And the only thing was that the paper airplanes were made out of my parents' discarded mortgage paperwork, showing all their like escrow accounts and all this stuff. And so, I think one of our neighbors called up my mother and said, "Hey, you should know that your son is out there selling your mortgage paperwork." So, it's been kind of this way since I was very small.
And now you're criticizing Facebook for violating other people's privacy when
I was 6, So, I think that's kind of what Mark Zuckerberg's excuse ought to be. Is like, look, I'm young. What do you want me to do? So, at any rate, that, and then, but really, I started doing tech-related entrepreneur stuff when I was like 12, 13, 14, and then started a company officially when I was 14. Selling computers and got a storefront and, that sort of thing. I think entrepreneurship is kind of a, it's a little bit of an inclination I think some people do have, but I think it's a mistake to maybe say that, you have to be born an entrepreneur. I think anybody can become an entrepreneur, but you have to have a certain kind of approach of seeing the world, which is that you have to believe that the world is something that you can shape. You have to be willing to take, I don't think huge risks, but relatively small risks and try experiments that, you're willing to kind of see what the outcome are and then just build on those experiments. So, my first company was, selling computers. That was an okay thing to do for a while, but then after a while, it became clear that the internet was going to be a big thing. So the first thing we did was to sell computer stuff online, but then it ultimately became clear that the online pieces itself were the more interesting pieces there. So we basically sold off all the computer related hardware, inventory, software, all that stuff, and then started focusing on just web hosting and internet access, and built that company up over the course of about 9 years. Started a telephone company in the process because we were able to within the context of the US Telecom Act of 1996. And so iterative, what's the next thing kind of process, and using entrepreneurship as a tool to address the world, I think is a really common, kind of approach that people have. And so now, whenever I see any kind of problem, I kind of just bring an entrepreneurial lens to solving it. It's not like I'm trying to be super business oriented or whatever. It's just kind of like, okay, well, how do you make some progress in that space without risking much? And then if it turns out that there's some kind of process that can be repeated, then you sort of institutionalize something around that, and that either that's a company or a nonprofit or whatever it is. And you say, okay, now, go off and do that. That's a repeatable process, and keep doing that until you have to stop for some reason, or you want to change your strategy. And that's just kind of a way of seeing the world. And I think, some people see the world, in other ways. They think about it in more like political ways of like, okay, well, I want to make a change, so I'm going to elect a leader or something, which is a perfectly valid and necessary thing to do. But it's a different thought process than saying, oh, okay, I see a problem, I'm going to approach this entrepreneurially. Okay, and you can mix the two, but they're two different things.
Going back to like 6-year-old Dave, obviously, you had it early, and there's two questions. One is what happened. When did you figure out that getting good at technical skills, making computers or doing technical things, was going to be a good entrepreneurial step, or was that more following hobbies and general interests? And also, just at the age of 6 and 7, did you do anything after that? Was it like you were doing things every year, from shoveling snow to cleaning people's cars to lemonade stands and like a whole blizzard of things? And the why?
Yeah.
Okay.
I did all that stuff. Yeah.
And what was the why? Because like obviously not everyone does this, and some people do. And I did some things like that, particularly retailing sweets at very high margins in my primary school for kids who weren't allowed off the premises because they lived there, and so I was kind of black marketeer, I suppose, in a very limited space. But why were you doing that? Were you financially driven? Did you have things you wanted to save up for, or was it more just like this seemed like a good idea? Can you unpick your early motivations?
I mean, I think my parents were always trying to kind of, impress upon me, how money works, and that, you do need to save up for things and stuff like that. So I think, I at least had some notion that, like I think I saved up once to like buy a bicycle, something like that. And so, I had an idea of kind of what the value of money was. And even though some of the entrepreneurial, enterprises were not exactly, I would call like big business, like the lemonade stand or whatever, where like, your main supplier is your mom and your product costs are fairly low, but it taught you that, you can get out there and make something out of nothing. And that was kind of cool. And so, with respect to that, I think it was just kind of, I just, felt a need to like occupy myself with something productive, I suppose. And then beyond that, with regards to the tech related stuff, my dad is an electrical engineer by training. And so was very interested in computers, as they were coming out. And so, I'm 47, which meant that I was 8 years old in 1979, which is kind of when, most of the microcomputer boom was happening with respect to the 6502 and the Z80 based machines. So I got involved with all that stuff. And, so we had multiple different kinds of computers at home, ranging from a Sinclair, ZX80 to a CPM machine. I later got involved in the Atari computers, like the, 800 and the 6502 based stuff. So, like I became a bit fluent in all of those different paradigms and, could write programs in BASIC or in 6502 assembly language. I mean, like there was just a lot of stuff that I got exposed to. So, I think that was a really special time for, I think, kids our age, because, you really were kind of getting a front row seat at the birth of an entirely new industry. And so, that was just kind of what I knew how to do. And so, being involved in that world and being steeped in the computer magazines of the day and going to the computer stores and all that kind of stuff, gave me an opportunity to kind of really understand that industry as it was blooming. And so, yeah, I wanted to be a part of it in some way, whether it was, as a retailer or as a creator of things or whatever it was. And so I just kept getting kind of further and further into it until, I kind of fully became part of the industry. And I mean, I think that's still something I'm doing. And I think it's kind of a thing you're never done with. You're always kind of taking things to the next step. So.
Yeah, well, I'm 6 years old. I've just had a birthday. I'm 6 years older than you, but it's certainly one of the things that motivated me and motivates me to be active in promoting different programs to support youth entrepreneurship, is that there was absolutely nothing like this going on when I was a boy growing up in Oxford. And I had a ZX81, the old Sinclair, and the first Sinclair Spectrum. But I remember going to Oxford County Library and looking for a book on how to program, and there wasn't one. And like, had there been, and this was in Oxford, which should be like, should is a dangerous word.
And I'm a little surprised you didn't find more,
Well, I mean, but it's interesting that just, I don't live in a sort of regrets mindset, because, you were alive now and you can always, we've all got lots
of program the ZX81 now,
or I could learn, there's plenty of ways to learn now, but it's interesting how, at that time, one of the biggest differences is if someone's interested in something now, there's really no excuse or barrier to them finding out about it right now. Right. They could switch off this podcast and start learning just like immediately, which is incredibly liberating. So what was there like a moment where you had like a business breakthrough where the something started making, I don't know what you'd call significant amounts of money, but like you were clearly starting to do a lot better than people who had a regular job? And was there a moment where, because I remember when I started my entrepreneurial career, I used to say to my now ex-wife, like, in 6 months' time, I'll know if this is going to work. And my needle just kept on ratcheting up. But there was definitely a time in the early 1990s when, my first business started going to 6-figure revenues and 7-figure revenues. And, I could just tell, oh, this is actually becoming a real business, as opposed to
it's something you can't necessarily easily walk away from. I think that's one of the indicators, is like when you can't just like leave it behind, it must be doing something right. But yeah, no, I started this computer software sales company when I was a teenager, and so I was in high school in the U.S. So I was 10th, 11th grade. And by like my 11th grade year, I had a retail shop. So, you know, with a lease and, you know, security deposit and all that kind of stuff. And so by the time that I was graduating from high school, you know, the business was doing something around like $1 million a year in revenue, maybe more. I forget right now, but it was something in that ballpark. And it was enough that, you know, I basically had to say, okay, well, you know, I've been accepted to go to a bunch of universities. I probably should do that, but I would like to maintain this business in some way. How am I going to do that? So I ended up going to Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, which I could actually commute to from my shop. So basically, you know, I was trying to run a business and go to full-time undergraduate school at the same time. And, you know, it was extremely taxing, like to the point of like me losing my mind, basically just because of the amount of hours per day and the difficulty of the coursework, which I wasn't used to because, you know, in high school, while the coursework was somewhat difficult, you know, there's a big difference between university level and kind of secondary school. So, you know, it was a big shock to my system to kind of take that on, but I ended up persisting. I ended up going to school for 1.5 years before I was just like, this is too much. I have to do something. So I basically focused on building up the business for about 2 years during that time, and got married, recruited my wife, my girlfriend, then now wife, to work with me on the business. So we, you know, grew that together. And then I eventually went back to school. It took me 3 more years to get my degree. So it took me 7 years to get what should have been like a 4-year degree. And it was kind of a long and twisting and torturous journey as well, because I didn't really know what I wanted to study. And I ended up studying a weird mix of like computer science, you know, like general science and liberal arts. So I ended up with a great mix of like, you know, philosophy and, you know, poetry and architecture and like you name it. I know something about all sorts of things, you know, which, you know, I think at the time seemed like a bad idea. Now I think it was the best possible education I could have had in terms of school education. So.
And so you must have been like your mid-20s, like 25, 27, and you had a good medium-sized computer retail business, like probably doing $2-3 million a year by that stage. So,
yeah.
You know, but if you're making 10% profit, you were doing okay, but it wasn't going to make you into a billionaire, but you were doing a lot better than normal for that stage in life, probably. Would that be correct?
Yeah, and you know, in the early days, I wasn't really taking much in the way of pay, and part of it was that, you know, like living with my parents and whatnot in the very early days, you know, you don't have to pay yourself very much in that context in order to survive, and your expenses are so low. So one of the things I tell students when I speak at university classes or high school classes is like, you know, don't be afraid to start with entrepreneurship at a young age. It's the best possible time, because your expenses are never going to be lower in your life. And also if you go, you know, get like a high paying job and you become kind of addicted to the lifestyle of, you know, having a big paycheck and having a nice house and a nice car and all that stuff, you're never going to want to like turn that down in order to go pursue the entrepreneurial lifestyle, which at first kind of by necessity has to be a bit more aesthetic. It just is. And, you know, but over the long run, you know, by building up that kind of equity and wealth over time and multiple businesses, you know, I've been able to be financially secure for a very long time. And that's good, you know, but at the same time, like, you know, you're always in charge of your own destiny, which is great and terrifying at the same time. So.
Okay, and so I mean, I don't know how much detail, but are there particular businesses which are like breakout business? I'll obviously share your LinkedIn, and you're involved in some angel investments, and you've got this kind of investment program. But is there like one thing in your business career you can look back and say this was the one that worked, or is it more like you're a portfolio person? You've got a few things that are doing okay, and there isn't like one dominant thing that is basically your lifeblood and your biggest business achievement.
Yeah, I mean, for me, probably the biggest thing that that I was involved in was this internet service provider company called ToadNet. And, you know, it wasn't a huge company, but I was basically the sole shareholder because it was funded out of bootstrapping from my previous company, which I was also, you know, eventually the sole shareholder in. So, you know, that just meant that by the time that we finally did build it up enough to be able to sell it, and then ultimately did sell it in a transaction that was, you know, meaningful, I benefited quite a bit from it. And so, in my mind, that's probably the main thing that I've done that's created the most, kind of value for me. But at the same time, like, the constraints on that business were because, I was the sole shareholder, meant that we didn't have other capital coming in to be able to grow the business larger. Had we done that, we could have grown the business larger. And so it's kind of a catch-22 to some extent there. And, you take the lessons you learned from that and hopefully apply it to some next things. But yeah, I mean, I've had several other businesses since then. A lot of them were just scratching like an itch of some kind that I just wanted to like experiment with and see what would happen. Other things are just things that were instrumental in helping me get to a next thing. And so, it all interplays, it all is interconnected. And like, I would never, one of the things I think that can be dangerous with entrepreneurship is to like pursue something because you think it's going to make money. I think that you should pursue something because you think it's interesting or hard or worth doing, or that maybe it'll lead somewhere. And so a lot of the like really, I would say, most interesting things that I've done have been things that maybe haven't made any money yet, or maybe never will, but it maybe have led to an opportunity that I otherwise wouldn't have had. So, I would say things like this Twitter visualization that I did never made any money, but it totally changed my life in terms of like connecting me to a different class of entrepreneurs and giving me other kinds of opportunities. And, likewise, getting involved with TED and TEDx, certainly I haven't made any money off of that, but it has been completely transformative in terms of getting to network with people like you and, others around the world. And qualitatively, it has made a huge difference in my life. And so that anything that I would choose to pursue entrepreneurially from this point forward would benefit from those investments in time and in relationships that have occurred. So, I think people should scratch what itches they have and, pursue what they think is interesting, and that will eventually lead somewhere. You just need to be able to make sure that you can pay your bills in the meantime. And, that can be a challenge, but once you've, kind of got some strategies for addressing that, then the rest is, kind of take care of itself. So.
Yeah, well, certainly. I mean, I certainly would wholeheartedly agree with that. And for anyone listening, thinking about why go into business, having a good financial outcome is a measure of success, but there are plenty of ways of having a good financial outcome without starting a business, and many of them are much less risky. So, but if there's something you want to do, and what you described, David, as the entrepreneurial mindset, where you come across a problem and you think, if that's a problem, how many other people have got that problem? Could I solve that problem? Would that be a profitable thing to do? That, is there a business case for working on that problem? Is a mindset, which I part-time teach courses in entrepreneurship, and one of the most challenging and rewarding things to teach is that mindset change, that it's not about being good at any one thing. It's about organizing a solution to a problem, putting together a team, and so on. So I suppose is there anything you've learned in before we move on to TEDx Mid-Atlantic and your story there, is there anything you've learned in your entrepreneurial journey that you'd like to share, like to someone listening who maybe has got a small business, they haven't made it yet, or they're thinking of starting a business one day? Are the things you've learned that you think are the most important things that you've got to tell them?
Well, I think the biggest thing, and you'll hear this from a lot of people, I think, is just sticking with it and, actually pushing through to realize, your vision. I do think that, we sometimes sort of falsely praise the idea of like, pushing through no matter what, eventually sometimes, you do get signals from the universe that like, hey, this isn't working, you should stop, I don't mean to ignore those signals, but I do think that, so much of just, having a successful outcome is just finishing the work. And I think sometimes people, want to kind of give up prematurely or, just get discouraged or whatever. And I think, it's important to just push through and kind of, push past whatever the barriers and the obstacles are to like, just see things through. And again, don't disregard, important obstacles that, are really in your way. But, if it's just a matter of like, 6 more months or, you need to figure out some different strategy or something like that, like that's just problem solving. So don't confuse problem solving with, like existential crisis. and I think, one thing that I definitely learned that I think a lot of entrepreneurs go through is that you end up kind of conflating your personal life with your business existence, especially like if it's your first company. You kind of get this feeling of like the company is me, like, I'm so closely associated with it that I feel every slight, every time there's a setback, you feel it in your gut, like, and you're never going to totally get over that as an entrepreneur. But at the same time, like, you do need to be able to kind of say, look, I'm David Troy, I'm a person, I have these characteristics, I, have my family, and no matter what happens, all that is there. And then, oh, by the way, there's this business that I'm involved in, and it's doing its thing, and it has its own characteristics, such that if for whatever reason you have to take the business out back and shoot it, you haven't done mortal harm to your own sense of self, And I think that that's a really hard thing to learn, but it's so vital. And some of it is just building the skills around, like, when do you think about business? When do you talk about business? I'm married to a co-founder, basically. So we have really pretty strict rules about when we do and don't talk about business. And so I think those kinds of life work kind of balance things can be very helpful in terms of not losing your shit when you're an entrepreneur. And so, yeah, that's something to think about.
Yeah, so basically summarizing, one is persistence as a key characteristic. And I know you're an angel investor and you run this angel investor organization, and certainly angels are always looking for evidence that the person who wants the money has that characteristic of being persistent and being ready to fight on. And as you said, not irrespective of the facts. You don't want to charge a light brigade and sort of run into enemy machine gun fire. But on the other hand, one of the things I say to people is, it doesn't matter what I think about your product or service. Tell me what the customers think. And if they say, well, it's really hard because I don't have a product yet. If they can come back to me and say, I've spoken to 10 potential customers, here are their LinkedIn profiles, their Facebook profiles, their emails, their phone numbers, I know that that person's persistent, because it's not easy to get in front of people when you don't have a product. And it may not be, it's not a guarantee of success, but it is the case that if they've talked to 10 customers who've told them that's really interesting, they'll be more motivated and I'll be more motivated. And if those 10 potential customers tell them to get lost, well, let's hope that they've taken that on board and maybe they should be doing something else. And the other thing is having that sense of distance between you and your businesses, that you are you and your businesses are your businesses. And they are like family members, but you also are not your son, you're not your daughter. You care about them, they're important. Let's say, I hope you don't take your children around the back and shoot them when rarely. That's not an idea worth spreading. Let's say, when one of the things I've noticed we've had in common is you're active in the sort of, let's say, the borderlines of politics and technology, advocating your spreading your ideas about the role of the big social media companies. You're obviously active in the community of investors as the angel investor. You're an entrepreneur, but you've also taken on different TEDx's, and I looked it up. It's not just the one you're in now, but it's TEDx Oil Spill, TEDx Mid-Atlantic, TEDx Baltimore. And I noticed 2009 was the first year on your TED CV when you started, which is more or less the same time as me. What drew you into the world of TED? Because it's quite a big undertaking, as we discover later after we're in, like almost unlimited amounts of emotional engagement, and obviously the time has to be limited by 24 hours a day. But it's more than a hobby, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, so I was actually traveling in China in 2009, and I was with a group called Geeks on a Plane, which was run by 500 Startups, the Silicon Valley-based venture incubator. And they put on a TEDx Shanghai event as part of this group, that was traveling there. We had an opportunity to attend this relatively small, very early TEDx event in Shanghai. And so it was put on by Richard Xu, who I think you know from the community. So anyway, I was really blown away by it. I thought it was really interesting and cool. And I had been aware of TED Talks, on distributed via like an iPod, in the previous couple of years. But I hadn't realized that they had done the TEDx program yet. And I, hadn't been plugged into TED really, individually before that. So anyway, I saw this, I said, this is really cool. I'd love to do something like this, where I live. And so I reached out to Laura Stein at TED pretty much right after I got back from China a few days later. And she said, oh, well, that sounds great. We'd love to bring you on board. Why don't you come attend TED Global in Oxford in 3 weeks or whatever. And I said, okay, cool. That sounds great. So I bought my ticket to Oxford, went to TED Global, and was just blown away by, the community there. And I don't know if you were at that particular event, but those couple of events that they did in Oxford were really amazing.
No,
at least especially to a first timer.
Yeah. No, because my story was slightly different. I grew up in Oxford, so I knew Oxford pretty well. But I was until I was sort of 18, 19. But then I went to Cambridge and in the UK and then came here to Poland. But the first TED organized events I went to were TED Global in Edinburgh, which was after they went there after Oxford. So I think
so 2011 or 12 or something like that.
Yeah, I might have been 12, 13 or 11, 12. But I volunteered to help with the first edition of TEDx Krakow, where I'm calling from, and had different roles in the team: a speaker, a sponsor, team member. But then for various reasons moved on to do a sub-city event called TEDx Kazimierz, which I've been doing, since, I started doing it in 2014. So I'm coming up to the sort of 5th anniversary of being the person responsible. And as you say, it changed. And so, yes, I think your story, you'd seen it online. Then obviously this Geeks on a Plane thing, I think now you're not allowed to do a TEDx unless you're from the place you're doing it. The leader of a TEDx has to be local, but possibly back then they were still figuring out their rules. Or was there a TEDx organizer in China who hosted you, or what exactly? Or don't you remember?
Yeah, no. So the TEDx event there was actually organized by a guy that lived in Shanghai. So it was done by Richard Xu, was the licensee.
Okay, got it.
The thing that was unique to what we were doing was I had this idea to do TEDx Mid-Atlantic, which if you're not from this part of the world, you wouldn't necessarily know what that means. I've had people ask me, like, is it in the Azores? Like, what do you mean Mid-Atlantic, And it basically means the Mid-Atlantic states on the United States East Coast. So like, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, New Jersey, that's kind of the typical definition that people give of the Mid-Atlantic area. But the reason why I wanted to focus on that geography specifically was it's a fairly large region with millions and millions and millions of people in it. And that's kind of a nice thing to draw from. But then B, there's a lot of cities in that geography. So like Baltimore, Washington, Richmond, Philadelphia, that are all kind of keep to themselves, So like if you do an event in Washington, people from Baltimore won't come, and vice versa. If you do something in Baltimore, people from Washington won't come. And we really wanted to do something that would bridge the region and cross-fertilize between the cities. So that was why we chose TEDx Mid-Atlantic as like the main banner. And so, we're reluctant to give it up now because I don't think they would reissue that now if we reapplied for it. So it's kind of grandfathered in at this point and has a good reputation. So we're just kind of holding on to that and, continuing on with that theme. But again, if you think about it, what that's really saying is what I was talking about earlier, bridging networks. We wanted to, instead of creating division between these cities, we wanted to find ways to link them together. And one of the things that we did at our last event was on the actual name badges list, show like what looks like a little sticker showing what state you're from. And we had people from Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, DC, New Jersey, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, all over the place. And that's kind of the magic of it, is being able to convene across those boundaries. So.
Absolutely. Well, there's one project that I don't know if you saw at the TED, and I think it's in the last quarter of last year. I think it may have been TED Women. They showed the video from the campaign to end loneliness in the UK called Be More Us, showing little kids talking to old people who are by themselves. It was one of the TED Shorts. Does that ring a bell? Do you remember that?
I don't know that I've seen that one, but it sounds believable.
What we showed that at our event last I think I was our TEDx Women Live. We showed that TED Short, and then I've been in contact with a lady who's actually been on this podcast called Alex Hoskin, who's got a great idea, which I've got earmarked for my next event with live speakers, which is called Chatty Cafes. And the idea is that it's a very, very simple idea, which is what's just so nice about it. You sign up on a website, pay £10. So like the three coffees, you get a sticker in the window saying you're a chatty cafe. You get a table stand, a stand to put on the table, and that by sitting at that table, you've pre-agreed you're ready to talk to strangers. And so it's a sort of, and it's a really simple idea. But I'm probably in the final quarter of this year going to volunteer to help her more actively. But we, in my entrepreneurship class, in the social entrepreneurship theme, we're talking about helping her with our TEDx. We're thinking of doing a TEDx adventure around that, because it's such a simple way of bringing people together. So potentially, if we go down that road, maybe you could help identify people in your region who like the idea.
I'm sure our community would be interested in engaging on that.
And what I thought, at the moment they're focused on cafes, but I also thought that if you look at what the reason Oxford or Cambridge colleges work and good companies work, there are spaces where people meet people from other departments. You know, this is that's why the kitchen is quite an important place, and a lot of or the water cooler can be an important place. And I've been wondering if there could be like a separate product for technology centers or co-working spaces or incubators, just because that kind of permission, that signaling that you're ready to have a conversation, is one of the most powerful problems to solve. That, you know, people are a little bit shy. These are micro things, but just that simple thing of a sign on the table could be quite powerful. So given your interest in bringing people together from different communities, that could be an interesting, I'm not quite sure what the word is. Well, I suppose idea or project that could help in your community.
Yeah, I love it. I think it sounds like a really, interesting little intervention. And I think, again, it's these small things that you just kind of keep investing in that can, I think, have an outsized impact over time. But you just kind of need to put yourself out there and find a way to kind of make these things work. But I think that's a great design idea. Okay.
Well, just before we wrap up, I've noticed you've signed up to help with one of my initiatives, the pre-event, the pre-summit social event. Can you explain what that is for someone who's no idea what I'm talking about? Because this is something that I kind of invented, and I'm not quite sure it's an idea worth spreading, but I do believe that, well, I've done it before. We'll find out. But yeah, with your involvement, it's bound to be successful. But what's your understanding of the pre-summit, the pre-TED Summit social gathering in Edinburgh on the 19th of July?
Yeah, so for those that don't know, TED holds several conferences per year, usually 2, maybe 3. I guess 3 is pretty typical right now, like TED Summit and TED Women, perhaps. So anyway, this year they're doing TED Summit in Edinburgh in July, and what we're going to do is just get together a bunch of different TEDx organizers from around the world to really, connect and get to know each other better. I think that's really the main driver. Sometimes at the TED conferences, they do like on like how to organize TEDx events and how to curate and do all the other sponsorship and all the other kinds of tasks that go along with it. But this will just be a more straight social gathering where we can, activate each other, get to know each other better. Probably build a little bit of trust, I think would be good. Really, get to exchange, a little bit more depth of information than we otherwise would. I believe there will be some food, possibly some drinks involved. So that could probably help. But it'll be a really nice opportunity to get to know some people that we already know better, but more importantly, probably to meet some new people that we don't know at all yet, and to bring them into our networks. Because again, it's this global network of TEDx folks that I don't know how many people you could kind of say are in that network at this point. It's probably in the at least 10,000 range, but there's probably at least a couple thousand that are like really active, and certainly Richard and I are in that category. So be a really good opportunity to just get to know each other better and connect.
Mm-hmm. And the wider, so this is exactly well described, and thank you. The wider observation I had a few years ago before going off to events in other cities is that quite often, if the people programming the event haven't forecast it, a lot of people who are from out of town will show up that place the evening before, and there's this kind of waste. There's a kind of type 2 opportunity. There are people there who actually are going to the event primarily, or at least part of their motivation is to meet other participants, and there's a sort of milling around, lack of lack of coordination, which to some extent social media can solve, but it's not ideal to be tweeting, hey, anyone going to South by Southwest who wants to meet, because, oh, I've lost you. Are you still there, David?
My machine is locking up for some reason.
I'll just rewind, just say, yeah, so the benefit of pre-events is to address the needs of people who arrive in a place the day before. And wider than that, I've also got an idea of the 5 or 10 minutes before things start, that if I'm giving a guest lecture somewhere, I show up. Quite often you get 15, 20, maybe 50, 100 people in a lecture theatre or in a function room waiting for something to start, and you, the speaker, are there, and everyone's sitting around waiting for things to start. And what triggered this was quite often one of my sort of background motivations is a sort of a rumbling anger when people are organizing things badly. And I remember the person who invited me said, well, we're going to start a bit late. I will start a bit late for the latecomers. And I sort of saw red, because I thought, well, I'm on time. These guys are on time. How dare you make us wait for how dare the latecomers make us wait for those who've made it? I said, you know what? I don't think we'll start late. I think we'll start early. And I just ran an icebreaker. And I said, okay, just starting in the front row, I'd just like you to stand up, introduce yourself, and say why you've come to hear me talk. And that was valuable. And then other times I've had people introduce them to each other. But that idea that, and in some cases it's been transformational. You know, you've discovered that people in the audience want to hear something completely different from what you intended to talk about, or else you're just waking people up. They were dozing away on their smartphones, and suddenly you've got a room of 400 people all having one-on-ones on why they showed up to this event, and it makes a huge amount of noise and just sort of transforms the culture. So, you know, the evening before, the day before, or even the 10 minutes before it, I feel is there's billions and billions of minutes being wasted every day while people are waiting for things to start. So this could be part of that.
That's a good insight.
Okay, good. So we're going to see each other. Well, in fact, we'll probably see each other on one of our organizational calls that's coming up. But we'll see each other in Edinburgh. Is there anything else about your TED or TEDx experience that you'd like to share to someone who's maybe was like you in 2007? They've seen a few TED Talks, they are aware they exist, but they're not engaged beyond that. What would you say to someone who's in that situation, as I'm sure some of our listeners are?
No, I would encourage people to try to get engaged with the organization of a TEDx event in their own community, just to get a little bit more of an up close feel of how it works. You know, I think every team is very eager to have competent people come help them. So you should be able to get a good response if you reach out in your community. And you know, if you don't get involved in organizing, you know, attend some. You know, I think, you know, be part of making those events better. I think, you know, it's incredibly difficult work to put those events on. A lot of care and time goes into them, but they can always be made better. So find ways to actually make them better. Whatever you do, don't try to make a TEDx organizer lend their platform to you to self-promote, because that is the most annoying thing that we as TEDx organizers have to face. But if you come at it from a place of authenticity and care, I think that you'll find it a very welcoming community. So
I think that's a very good note to end on. The most wonderful phrase you can hear from someone who introduces themselves to you as a TEDx organizer is, I'm X, how can I help you? You know, that is, you know, and rather than you should do this, you should do that, and I want the other, it is really unwelcome. But I'm Absolutely. X, how can I help? And it can be indeed transformational. David, you've given us an hour of your time, so for that, many thanks. If anyone wants to get in touch with you, what should they do?
Best thing to do is just email me. I have a lot of email addresses, but an easy one is davetroy@gmail.com.
That's very easy. I'll put that in the show notes. And if anyone wants to follow up on any of these things that I've mentioned, contact me. And if you've got suggestions or comments for other people on the Project Kazimierz show, either you, David, or any of the listeners, I'm always good to look at new opportunities to share the ideas of interesting people. Thank you very much indeed, and goodbye.
Sounds good. Thanks, Richard. See you in a few weeks.
Indeed. Bye-bye.